All right, we're live.
Awesome.
I'm going to post a link in Google Classroom for you guys so you can see the lecture. It's about a 12 or 13 second delay.
Gotcha.
If you want.
So,
Okay. Let's see what we got. So we're going to give some more time for some students to come in?
they're all just going to stream in.
Okay.
But we have about 3 more coming. Did you want any coffee or anything?
Coffee would be good.
We don't have to pay more, but we have to find someone. We can start whenever you want.
Are you sure? Okay.
Yeah, they'll just miss out.
Okay, I just want to give
You
them
also
plenty of
get a
time.
notification of the live stream,
Okay,
so watch on the
very cool, awesome. All right. So, I'm Justin. I'm a cryptographer. If I don't sound like I'm from California, it's because I'm not from California. I'm from North Carolina. Moved here about 4 years ago. And I've been working in cryptography for about, I would say, 16 years now. So quite a while. I've seen a lot change with technology, the demand for cryptography, how different roles have changed in security that make it a lot easier to get involved nowadays than it used to be. So a little more about me. I figured we would start by just me telling sort of a story about how I got into the field, sort of where cryptography is today, how I originally got into it versus how students today have a better shot at getting into different fields of interest with the whole Internet of Things, with mobile security, which is its whole entirely new thing. So I'd start telling some stories, and then after that we're going to dive right into a cryptographic algorithm. So you're actually going to get to see and walk through how a cipher works. And this is a scaled down version of probably the most secure cipher in existence today as far as modern cryptography goes. So we'll do a little bit of storytelling so you can kind of get a sense of how you can apply this. And I understand you might already be taking coding sort of courses. Tell me a little more about what you're doing with coding.
So they've learned HTML, CSS, and JavaScript a little bit of JavaScript, and also C# is going to be explored with video and development.
Nice. So the cool thing about those two things is that JavaScript, arguably one of the most used languages around in web development. With that said, a lot of cryptography gets implemented in JavaScript. Now this is both really good and really bad because browsers are easily manipulated by attackers, especially being exposed to the web. So there's a lot of fragility that comes along with writing secure JavaScript. The cool thing is that nowadays you can do some really powerful cryptography with JavaScript. So a lot of JavaScript is, in fact, tasked with protecting the most sensitive data that's flowing between browsers. A lot of JavaScript handles credentials and handles the actual processing of secure data. So JavaScript, if you're learning JavaScript, there's a really big demand for engineers who have a security mindset for writing JavaScript, just because of the risk associated with working in the browser anyway, versus a piece of software that's sitting on a desktop that can run offline that's not connected. You have different attack models, different risks associated with that. Now with game development, that's one where it might not be too obvious where cryptography fits in. But if you think about, I got a question from a class a week ago about Fortnite. They're like, can you hack into Fortnite? I'm like, probably not. I said, because game developers, they put a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of engineering time into securing games for the purpose of people not being able to cheat. Because if you can cheat, you can get unfair advantage over opponents. You can completely ruin the experience. And if you can consider how much money goes into building a game, promoting a game, they want to make it as challenging and as enticing as possible. So if someone came in and found a way to hack it, at an unfair advantage, the challenge of the game disappears because they know they're not working on a level playing field. So game development is a really big area for security, for totally different reasons and different risk models. But security, or specifically cryptography, it spans pretty much any industry online today. So a little more about how I got started in cryptography. So picture me sitting in front of the TV, about 8 years old, watching some documentary that came on about World War II or whatever, which was a kind of foreign concept at that age. So I'm sitting there, and this episode comes on about the Navajo Code Talkers. And what was really intriguing about the Navajo Code Talkers is that during World War I and II, they were able to speak their native language, which wasn't written at the time. So they would communicate via radio in the Navajo language. So let's say the Japanese or the Germans that were listening in couldn't make any sense of it because they had no written documentation, nothing to refer to. It just sounded like random sounds coming over the waves. So that was when it really got me interested in the use of secret codes, protecting data with language, well before I got into intense math. And also I'll talk more about how you might think of math and cryptography as sort of being two joint things, that you have to be in one to be in the other. But given the rise of like coding boot camps and sort of this shift of mobile programming, it's a lot easier to learn to code. And as a computer science sort of major, if you get into more of the engineering and coding track, you can do a lot more than cryptography than if you just had a math background. So you don't even have to worry about math really to work in cryptographic engineering. To sort of go back to how I got into cryptography. So this was the late night, well, when I was a kid, this was probably 88, 89. So I'm 34 now, so this was well before I got to my teens and really got a chance to work in writing code and all that. But back then, you didn't have coding boot camp, so it was really challenging to get involved in security and privacy and coding. So you'd go online, and at that time, getting online was a very primitive thing. Like you could join these bulletin board systems, you could send email to chat groups. There weren't really any social media networks. Things were a lot more textual than they were visual, and not many people were online compared to today because you didn't have mobile phones. Like the first iPhone came out in 2006, which changed security forever. So I started working on some open source projects, writing some very primitive code, getting an idea of how security applied to writing code. Then I realized that all of the really intense cryptographic problems had already been solved in the 1970s. I wasn't born until the 80s. So the chance that I could actually contribute in a big way to math was slim to none. So I'm like, okay, I'm not going to focus so much on the math. I want to get into the actual engineering. Then I realized that engineers were having a really hard time writing secure code because cryptography involves a totally different skill set. And cryptographers weren't really talking to developers much at the time. You had people designing the math, then the engineers had to take that math and somehow write code to implement that math. So you ended up having really secure cryptography, but really insecure code because there was a disconnect between these two groups of people. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to sort of work as a liaison between the math people and the developers. Then I got into that area of security. So I started working, helping cryptographers make sense of engineering challenges, and then helping engineers make sense of what exactly they needed to do to write secure code. Once I got past that point, I realized that consumers were still getting their hands on really insecure software, and they were being asked to configure things that didn't make a lot of sense. So that's when I started to realize that the usability of security software was really bad, and they were passing on decisions to the user to make that were really frustratingly hard to understand. So long story short, my career has sort of evolved from really liking the mathematical side to liking the engineering to liking the sort of the human element of how people interact with software. So the point there is that if you're not into math, you can still get into cryptography. You can write secure code. You can work to address what we call threat models. And a threat model is basically when you look at a piece of software and what you're going to use it for, you think about all the different ways that an attacker could get into that software. And then you try to secure it, whether it's in that code itself or you're setting up a firewall or provisioning networks that tighten access control. There's a ton of things that go into making sure it's secure. So you don't have to be a mathematician. Now, if you don't want to be a computer engineer and you like working more with user experience and usability and design, a lot of the reasons that security fails in practice is because it doesn't make sense to the consumer. They'll ask you to, do you want to allow this software access to this, this, and that? So it's sort of a yes or no question. And as a usability expert, if you work really hard at understanding how users think, then you can help them make good decisions, good security decisions, without having to understand all the complexity behind it. So yeah, that's sort of a progression of how back in the day you had to really be in security and mathematics and computer science to work in that field. But now that we have Internet of Things, everything's online, you have mobile phones, you have social media, gaming is online, whereas it used not to be years ago. There's a ton of different opportunities to work in security and privacy. So, now that I've got that story out of the way, is there anything that you would like to specifically learn or cover in security, or related to engineering that's interesting?
I don't know what it is.
Don't know what is?
Cryptography.
Cryptography.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fun fact, cryptography is the first use of a pure mathematical applied set. Because everybody thought it was useless before that.
And one of the first supercomputers at the time was built to crack cryptography during wartime. So the interesting thing about cryptography is that the need to break really powerful cryptography sort of gave rise to digital computing during wartime. And a lot of interesting technologies came out of defense and military. So that's a good question. So cryptography, so imagine I have some data that I want to secure, all right? And let's say that data is my credit card data that I'm going to send to Amazon to buy something. So the first thing that happens is when you go to a secure page on Amazon's website and you click the buy button, you put in your credit card details, a request is sent from your computer to Amazon servers. And they do what's called a secure handshake. And that handshake consists of deriving this shared key. So imagine a door lock on the front door. If I make a copy of my key and I give it to you, then you have access to my door, I have access to my door. So we both have shared access to the same thing. The same thing happens with cryptography in practice. So once you and the Amazon server have this shared key, you can start using that to lock your data, and imagine it being in a locked box. So you put the data in the box, you lock it, you send it to Amazon. They use that shared key that you mathematically, very magically derived with this algorithm. They unlock it, they take it out, they process the payment, then you have established a secure connection that way. So cryptography, in short, is just a way to use math, an algorithm, to turn data into something that can't be read unless you have this shared key. And there are two types of cryptography. So symmetric cryptography and asymmetric. Symmetric is when you're using the same key to encrypt and decrypt. Asymmetric is when you use one key to encrypt and then another key to decrypt. And the utility there is if before the 1970s there was only secret cryptography. So let's say I'm here in San Francisco and you're in Germany and I want to send you a message, but we don't really have an easy way to decide on the key to share. So how would we come up with that key? Would I give you a phone call and read the key to you? Well, that's not very safe if someone's listening in on the phone. Would I email you the key? Well, email's not very safe either. They secure it to some extent, but then you're exposing it to whoever runs the email server. So it's not really a good way to share the key. So with public key cryptography, there is a way to make two keys that have this special relationship. One you use to scramble the data, and one you use to unscramble it. What's unique about the one that you use to encrypt is that it's considered a public key. So you can share your public key to everybody in the world. It doesn't need to be secret. So if they encrypt data with your public key, you only have the private key that goes along with it. So when they send you that data, you use the private key to unlock it. So it's a very unique two-key system where you can publish this public key that anybody can use to send you data securely, and then you have that secret piece that unlocks it. And there's a special relationship that allows these two keys to be made. Now the downside to public key cryptography is it's really slow. So imagine the difference between a turtle and a rabbit running a race. Symmetric key cryptography is like the rabbit. It's really fast. It can handle a long distance at that high speed. With data, it can handle encrypting a ton of data at a high speed. Public key cryptography is really slow. So for the internet, since we're streaming like high definition data, like gigabytes and terabytes of data, it wouldn't be possible to do all this with just public key cryptography. So the way modern systems work is that you have the public key and secret key, that pair, and then you have a symmetric key set. So once you arrange this public key pair that you can use to securely share information, you actually use the symmetric key algorithm to encrypt all your bulk data. So instead of sharing messages with your public and private key pair, you're sharing the keys that you'll use for the faster algorithms. So that way you're sharing the keys securely, and then when you have the keys, you're using the faster algorithms to actually encrypt and decrypt the data. So it's really, really fast, and it allows you to do it pretty much anywhere in the world that you have a network connection and want to have this secure handshake. Is this making some sense so far? All right. One of the other cool things about cryptography is that, and this kind of goes to one of the more fun aspects of my career that I did a few years ago, is with penetration testing and social engineering. And this isn't so much hacking the cryptography first as it is sort of hacking the person. So I'll tell you about a job that I got to work on. It was really cool. I won't go into any specific details about who it was for and all that, but I'll keep the substance of it. So it was for a rather large medical institution, and they hired me to come in as a penetration tester. And they're like, we're going to give you free reign within boundaries. We don't want you to shut down our systems and take us offline completely, but we want you to gain access to our facility and gain access to certain data that's, in the medical field especially, they're under heavy regulation, especially with patient records, things that detail funding they've received to do special research. There's lots of really confidential information. So my goal was to gain access to this information. They're like, we're going to give you absolutely nothing to work with. You just start fresh and cold. You pretend that you're an outsider that wants to hack into the hospital. Go. That's pretty much how it was. So the first thing I did, and the cryptography part comes at the end of it, is I went to a Starbucks across the street from the medical institution because everyone takes their laptop to a coffee shop. And I assumed that everyone at this institution, rather than getting in their car and going somewhere else, would just walk across the street to the Starbucks. So this would probably be the easiest way to meet someone from the institution or gain access. So I sit down, I see people come in, some wearing their attire, like nurses coming in. I'm like, okay, with the nurse, they don't have a lot of access to the type of data I'm looking for, but I'll sort of see what I can do to maybe strike up, build rapport and strike up friendships with people. So you'll see people come in, all sorts of different people. People like students that go to a college nearby, so it's not just hospital personnel. So it's really hard to tell who works there and who doesn't unless they have a badge. So one of the easiest ways to do it is with a packet sniffer or wireless software that will look for different information about stuff coming over the streams. At that time, the networks that Starbucks used were a bit less secure than they are now. So, for example, I could set up this packet sniffer, and I could see traffic coming across the network. And with MacBooks, when you register your MacBook for the first time, it asks you to put in your first and last name. Then when you identify yourself on a network, for example, my name is Justin Troutman, it'll say Justin Troutman's MacBook. And that is a signature for my computer. So if you're watching traffic go across the network with a packet sniffer, you would see some point in time Justin Troutman's MacBook pop up. So given that we're in an age of social media, there's a good chance that everybody has a profile somewhere. So if you were to go online and type in Justin Troutman, you would find a Twitter account, you would find LinkedIn, and in that social media profile, you would see a picture of who I am. So before that, you don't know what Justin Troutman looks like, but you know he's in the cafe somewhere because you're picking it up on the traffic. So once you have the picture on the screen that you referenced online, you would look up and see if you see that person in the cafe. And now that you have access to the social media, you have access to who they are, what they do, what they're interested in, and you can use that to try to build rapport with someone that has access to something you need. And what's really interesting about this field is that it plays into psychology and sociology and different things about humans that have nothing to do with cryptography at all. So sometimes when you're faced with, defending or securing against a system technically, sometimes the weakest link is not technical at all. It's the person that might have access. It's the janitor that might have a set of keys to a network server room that you need access to. He has no account on the system, but if you can make him believe that you work there or strike up some friendship, or maybe he just doesn't want to confront you about who you are, it's easier just to let someone in a door. It's like, for example, a secured access door. If someone's behind you carrying some heavy boxes, you put your key fob up to the door, you open the door, and they're like, hey, could you hold that door for me? The natural inclination is that you want to be kind and hold the door for that person so they can carry the boxes in. But when you do that, they've never swiped credentials. You have no idea if they even belong in that building. But they've used very basic human aspects of wanting to hold a door for someone and be helpful and sort of cooperative to gain access to the door. So that's one big takeaway, is that if you're interested in security and privacy, don't think it's just a technical thing. If you have people skills and human skills, it's much harder to find someone with those skills than it is to teach someone coding. So if you're naturally good at striking up friendships and getting access to things or negotiating lower bills on your cell phone bill, those kinds of skills translate actually really well to the security field. So jumping back to my experience there in the coffee shop. So there was an individual who I was able to match up with social media by seeing his signature on the packet sniffer, like John Smith's MacBook. Typed in John Smith, there's a picture that looks like John Smith in the line. So when you want to build rapport very quickly, you need to find something very obscure. So for example, if I get in the line and I pretend to be on the phone, and I say something, let's say I'm pretending to be on a phone call and I'm like, yeah, I got tickets to the Warriors game. Well, let's assume this happened in San Francisco. Well, there are a ton of Warriors fans. Nobody's going to turn around and look if they hear somebody talk about the Warriors. But let's say that they're a fan of some really, really obscure sports team, or a sports team that never wins. It's a really bad team that everybody makes fun of or whatever. I might pick that team. Yeah, I might pick that team and say something like, yeah, I'm going to go see this game, or maybe it's a really obscure band that they like that nobody's heard of. I can do some quick research to learn enough about that band to know what style of music they play. I can say, yeah, I got tickets to this band the other night. And if it's obscure enough, it might get your attention. Because if you're a fan of something that not many people enjoy, or something that's really obscure and not mainstream, you feel this almost instant connection to anybody who likes that too, right? So using those things will help you get people's attention. And it just so happened that I picked something really obscure. I got the person's attention. He's like, oh, that's awesome. I didn't know many people knew about that group. I said, yeah. I said, I'm getting tickets. I said, actually, I've got an extra ticket. I said, do you want an extra ticket? I said, I can't find anybody who wants it. So in the span of 20 minutes, I've identified somebody that works, that has access. I've invited them to some concert from a band I didn't know existed until 5 minutes ago. And he has access to some of the things I need. So from that point forward, once you have that rapport built, you can start a conversation, because inevitably they're going to ask you what you do for a living. It's like, oh, I work in technology for the medical field. I'm in here for a conference. I'm working on this research. And you want to be, as someone doing penetration testing, that the goal is to gain access for the purpose of highlighting insecurities. So you have to be really careful not to abuse this power that you have to gain access to things outside the realm of what they've granted you access to. But at the same time, you want to be as natural as possible, because you want to expose flaws in even people that have secure mindsets. So naturally, people who are given high access, they might be a little more careful about what they reveal. So you don't want to make it too obvious. But when you build this rapport, let's say I tell this guy that, hey, I'm here for a medical conference. I work in this area of research. I tailored the conversation in a way that he's like, yeah, we're doing similar research. He's like, you'd probably like to meet this person that I work with at the institution. So the goal is to work your way in. And then once you get in, it just so happens, human nature, when you're around like-minded people want to talk about what they do, especially if it's very obscure. So if someone's working on research that not many other people understand or appreciate, they might be more willing to tell you about it because they're excited. So you're exploiting things in people like their excitement about what they do or shared interests. And if you do it just right, you can very quickly gain access to the right people. So moving on from that, once I was able to be on site, I stayed around, and my mannerisms and my posture was enough that it almost seemed like I was employed there. People thought I was a visiting professor, a visiting medical doctor. So if you kind of start dressing like they do, and this was a multi-week process. So if you start hanging around people or taking different entrances or parking, and the goal is to look like you know where you're going and look like you belong where you are, especially in this instance. Because if you do, nobody's going to question you. So as a pen tester, you have to very quickly learn to emulate the human behavior of the people that you're trying to manipulate to get access to a system. And what's nice about penetration testing is that for companies, it's a very safe way to emulate a real attack. So instead of just leaving it up to chance, they hire someone who is very ethical, has done this for a living. They can come in and do everything an adversary would do, and the end goal is that they get a heads up on insecurities that they can fix. And when they fix those insecurities, they don't have to worry about an actual attacker coming along later and hacking into the system and leaking the data. Because back then there was no WikiLeaks, there was no pirating sites to share mass leaks of data. But now the stakes are huge as far as protecting data, because it's really easy to have millions and billions of records leaked. Like if you go on any security site, even mainstream media, you'll read about some company got hacked, from PG&E to airline companies. It doesn't matter. Like there's a lot of money in gaining access to credentials. So once they do, it hits the market very quickly. So again, if you find yourself interested in security and privacy, these are areas to pay attention to, areas where they need people that can think about the psychology and the sociology of security and privacy. So at the end of this whole pen testing exercise, I was able to gain access to secured rooms. And when you gain access to secured rooms, you have systems that you need access to. Well, passwords are really hard to deal with. So not all departments treat password security the same. You'll still find people writing down passwords on Post-it notes. You'll still find people that will tell you the password. Like if you walk up and say, hey, especially if you know an old password, if you walk up to someone and say, hey, I thought the password was still this, that indicates to the person that since you knew the password that they were using 2 weeks ago, that you must have had access to it. So they'll just go ahead and give you the new one because you're the cool guy now because you gave them the password and saved the day. They don't have to go through IT and all that long process. So things like that you learn the more you do it, but you also learn to go for the weaker links or really play on the human aspect of security. And at the end of all that was sets of cryptographic keys that I needed to gain access to databases of information. And these databases contained the most confidential of medical information. So that's usually where I would stop. Once I gain access to the credentials, I certainly don't access the information. You take it, you sort of wrap up your test because you've got access to what you need. You write your report, you present all that and say, here are all the weak points. Here's what you need to do to fix it. You definitely want to assist them with making sure it gets fixed. So what you've done essentially is, potentially saved a company from a PR nightmare, from waking up to finding the Wall Street Journal saying that you've leaked 500 million patient records. And it's a really small cost to invest in pen testing. And sometimes it's even better when you're consulting and you're working as a contractor versus a company because you're able to work on a ton of different jobs rather than just one specific industry. So there is a huge market for penetration testers that work on what they call red teams. So you have blue teams and red teams. Blue team for defense. So there are penetration testers that specifically work on defending systems. Then you have red teamers who work on hacking into systems. And these days you'll have companies that build both teams and sort of merge them on what they call purple teams. So it's a collective team of experts on defense and offense. It's sort of a demolition derby, really, of trying to secure and break until they arrive at some very secure system. So that's one very long story that initially had nothing to do with cryptography, but even though I was given the task of, we want you to try to get these keys to this data, that sounds like a cryptography problem, but 99% of the process to getting there was simply paying attention to the humans that had access to what I needed. And that's something when you're taking sort of the engineering track and the boot camp and the coding track, you spend a lot of time working on code. But we're in a very social media, social age where people are sort of extending all aspects of their life into the digital space. So human behavior has a lot more to do with it than it ever did. So again, if you have those skills where you're really good with people, people trust you, you're able to get things very easily with the way you talk and the way you present yourself, these are all really useful security skills. And they're really in high demand because it's hard to teach that to someone versus teaching them coding. So yeah, psychology, sociology, those are two really emerging areas of security and privacy. So I've kind of went on with a narrative, but I hope that was insightful because it's not the usual, the typical thing you think about when you think about digital security and privacy. Any thoughts or questions on that?
So will that apply to the blue team as well, being able to forge up relationships like that? Or is it really only for the red team? So this is how they have to actually get it.
Would it apply to the blue team as well? It will. So what you want to think about when you think about blue team is, let's say that after this penetration test happened, this person that I used, or one of the many people I used to gain access, he becomes someone that you would want to work with maybe directly to say, what you just experienced, we're certainly not, going to be hard on you for what happened because it was a very sophisticated attack, because it's very targeted. It's not just someone scanning the internet for open ports and randomly hacking what they can get access to. This was someone going at a specific person, very targeted. So blue teams will typically sit down and help train people on how to defend against these attacks. Because again, it's really easy and natural for us to want to give access. So a blue teamer will say, these are the different things you might encounter. These are the different signs that may let you know that someone is trying to manipulate you. Or maybe they're not trying to manipulate you. Maybe they're interested in what you do, and you might accidentally give up information you shouldn't. So blue teamers specialize in sort of training for how to defend and recognize these attacks. Because what happens is, even though security is a sort of an organizational-wide thing, like security matters to everybody, you typically only see people putting emphasis on departments that have access to confidential data. So they might not train a front desk receptionist on security the same way they would someone that had a security clearance to confidential information. And what's bad about that is that that's the obvious way to try to gain access, to walk up to the front desk, make that person think you're someone that you're not, and have them direct you to a place or open a door for you, or introduce you to someone. So that's sort of what blue teamers look for. Of course, red teamers, when you think about the weak points, their job is simply to find the weakest point and exploit it. So they're thinking about, who can I access, or who can I attack to gain access? Who's the easiest target? And they sort of map out all the different people in the organization that might have what they need, and then they decide who they're going to go for first. Because you have to be really careful as a pen tester with that too, because if you try to do too much too quickly, you could reveal what you're doing, or you can make people suspicious. And once you make someone suspicious, that spreads, and then the operation's over. So you failed, and the company likes that you failed because you didn't manage to get to their system. But those flaws still could exist. So the goal is to be as effective as you can. So it's sort of a joint thing between red team and blue team. Yeah.
Is it possible to incorporate social engineering in the man-in-the-middle attack?
So when you think like man in the middle, like a network attack where you're...
Packet spoofing.
Yeah, so you could, one example might be, let's say I pretend to be an IT guy, and this is actually a common method. I call you, let's say you're sitting at your office, I call you, I say, hey, this is Justin from IT, we're getting ready to roll out this upgrade to the system, this security patch. We discovered some flaw in the system, we want you to upgrade. Can you download this file? I'm going to send you this file, I just need you to download it, put in your credentials, it'll install the patch, you'll be good to go. Now, your first thought might not be that I'm someone pretending to be IT, because you might have never received this kind of call before. So if I can convince you that I'm IT, maybe I can tell you the station number of your computer. Maybe I can give you some information that indicates that I know who you are and where you're sitting, what your computer network ID is, something easy to get like that. If I get you to install this software and you run it, that could install some man-in-the-middle software. That way, everything you do from that point forward sends me that data. So it might be encrypted, but if I install man-in-the-middle, maybe I stick that right before the encryption process happens. So before it gets to where it's going, it sends it off to some IP address that I've hard-coded into that malicious software. So it's like a man-in-the-middle attack that can do things like it can spoof its origin, it can hide its origin. So even if they were able to discover that it was going somewhere, maybe I've used Tor, some onion routing system, to bounce off different IPs all over the world. So even if someone finds that malware later, it would be clear how to track it. But in the meanwhile, it's transmitting everything to me. So I've incorporated a little social engineering to get you to install something that can spoof packets, that can grab packets.
So how is that different from using keyloggers?
Different than keyloggers? So if you can do a software keylogger, if you can get a software keylogger in, that's very effective. I know a lot of the most effective keyloggers are going to be hardware-based, because a lot of the software-based ones have signatures that security software can easily pick up on, because that is a legitimate problem. So it might be more difficult to get me to install a keylogger that could be scanned and detected, versus getting you to install something that's more hidden and more surreptitious, like harder to recognize or find, something that's very obscure, that's low-level code, that's not as recognizable, even if someone does a security scan. So you're kind of getting the data, you're getting the same data, just different ways. So keyloggers can work. Software, it's a bit harder to install those than it used to be. They're more easily detected. Hardware keyloggers would require me getting physical access to your machine. Or one method is, and it's still attempted today, is pen testers will go to the parking lot of an organization that they're doing a pen test for. They'll drop USB sticks, let's say in the parking lot, or they'll lay a USB stick on the counter in the restroom, unlabeled, so there's no way to know who it belongs to. So if you do this enough, someone's going to be curious enough to take that and plug it in to see what's on it. And if you set auto run on a USB stick, and their computer's not set up to reject automatically running the contents of that USB stick, it could automatically upload this malware, this software keylogger to your computer. So there are different ways to go about getting it there. And you really have to sort of consider what the target is, how likely they are to know about these types of attacks. So it's a very customized type of field to be in as far as pen testing. You have to do a lot of research about the target to really understand what their flaws might be.
Unrelated, what's this blue thing on your shoulder?
So this is a walkie-talkie. It's a Bluetooth walkie-talkie that pairs to a cell phone. So you get into a group of people, and if they have these, or even if they're using the app in the phone, they just sort of push and talk like a walkie-talkie.
So it's like AirPods on your neck.
Similar. Yeah, I mean,
It's like a walkie-talkie.
Yeah, pretty much just a walkie-talkie Bluetooth walkie-talkie rather. But yeah, so this does use cryptography too. So you got, when I press the button and transmit data, it uses Bluetooth encryption protocol to encrypt it, sends it to my phone. Then the app has its own cryptography built in to send that to the server, encrypted, and then it transmits all that data to the group, and everybody hears my voice. So there's a lot of security going on in the device.
People around you can hear it.
Unless you have a headset plugged into it, so it has a little earphone jack, so you can connect it there.
I got it.
Yeah, so yeah, you definitely could hear if you didn't have that plugged in. So typically I would have a headset, or I might be somewhere where I didn't have to worry about people hearing. Yeah. See, I almost forget to take this off. It sort of hangs there indefinitely until it runs out of battery and I have to charge it again.
Why are you here today? I came in late.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, my goal was, well, I did some storytelling at the beginning about how I got into cryptography. So I've been a cryptographer for about 15, 16 years. So the goal was to come in and sort of share how I got into cryptography, and then talk a little bit about how that's applicable across different industries. So if you're into coding, into engineering, or not, cryptography has a lot of impact in different areas. And also the last thing we're going to do is run through a cryptographic algorithm. So to show you a scaled down version of the cipher that's used to protect pretty much all data online today. It's called the Advanced Encryption Standard. So, and it's really, really simple. I mean, I've tailored it down to teaching 7 and 8 year olds how to do advanced cryptography using more visual-oriented techniques. So, do you have a question?
Have you tried to get like a CH certification?
Yeah, you know, I thought back when those first came out, I thought about getting those, like ethical hacking certifications. It's interesting to watch. Like when they first came out, they were very much ahead of their time because a lot of organizations weren't requiring certifications because the field was still a lot newer than it is now. So I don't have any of those certifications because I got into the field far earlier than those existed. So you sort of develop field knowledge just having done it so many times versus taking a course if you're coming into it new. So they're really cool certifications. They are. And I think the Department of Defense recognizes CEH, CISSP, a ton of different certifications are now recognized at military and government levels as being almost requirements for some folks coming in. A lot of banks, defense contractors, a lot of higher level institutions that deal with government data or just require clearances will require you to get those certifications at some point. So,
Last question,
yeah.
stay curious one. If you were to choose being a hacker, what type of hacker would you like to be?
Kind of a hacker I like to be. Hackerman from, yeah.
I mean like,
Yeah.
I mean like between like,
Sure.
From Kung Fury.
black hat hackers,
Sure.
and that kind of.
So, what's cool about sort of the way my career has progressed is that I'm very much white hat in my sort of my mentality. Like I'm very much defense minded. Like I want to help people build systems that are robust and secure. But to do that, you have to think like a black hat, right? I mean, you're not going to be effective unless you can emulate exactly what a black hat would do. Because if there's any difference between the two, then your results are not going to be quite as useful. Like if I do a pen test and I require them to help me along the way to gain access, then that's not like a true black hat because a black hat wouldn't have any help. So even though I may be able to give them results, they wouldn't be as good because they had to give me help. They had to help me along the way. So I kind of like what I do now, where I get to be a white hat. So I get to do ethical things for companies to help them become more secure. But doing that requires sort of switching into black hat mode. The difference there is that you enter lots of agreements and sign lots of paperwork that says, what you do stays with this company, the results stay with them. You would certainly not discuss specifics about, the company you work for. So a lot of it's very secret as far as what you can talk about. But you do get to share stories about the industries and specifics about the types of techniques you use.
So given that everything that you do is like super secret, how do you think that affects like the development of cryptography? Like, does it help it? Does it hinder it? Because like if every company keeps everything a secret, like what doesn't work whenever I try to hack IBM might work whenever I try to hack Lockheed Martin or something.
Sure, that's a fair point. So the difference there is that if you work for, let's say, the NSA or Apple, they're extremely secretive. You can't talk about the research you do. You can talk about nothing. I started out sort of in the academic space of cryptography where everything's open and published. So I can still publish papers talking about everything I did, just not specifics about the targets or who, hired me to do what. So you can still, discuss the techniques in full. So that's usually what happens when pen testers work on big jobs like this. They have versions of reports or entirely different papers where they can share this with the community, they can share this with other people in the industry that care about it, to read that this was a real case and these attacks were attempted, they were successful. So there are things that you can talk about very openly. So, and that's the space I prefer in, because way back in school, like high school, beginning of college, I had a strong interest in math, and I was one of quite a few people that went through a recruitment sort of process with the NSA. So they heavily wanted to recruit people to work in mathematics and cryptography, and they still do. It's the largest employer of mathematicians in the world. They used to be the largest purchaser of hardware, computer hardware in the world. So they're like, if you're into hardware and into mathematics, they're going to do the most cutting edge stuff. The downside is that you can't talk about it. And because everything I learned was from the community, from the open community, I sort of wanted to extend that in my career by staying in a path where everything I did I could share, even if it had to be toned down in a way not to put any company I worked with in jeopardy. I still wanted to be able to do things that I could share to help other companies, to help other up-and-coming pen testers learn about how things work and what to look out for. Any questions before we jump to the next thing?
Next thing.
Next thing, all right. So let's get this pulled up. And do you guys normally take a break in between?
I mean, like, technically, yes.
Okay. You good?
I mean, do you guys need a break? I like to take them away from.
Okay.
He likes to pump chess.
You might be okay.
Okay, all right. Yeah, we can do it. All right.
And faster, you said, right?
What's that?
Asymmetric's faster than symmetric?
Actually, symmetric is faster. Yeah, no, it's
Yeah, but
easy.
asymmetrical is a lot more secure, right? And it's somewhat simple.
So asymmetric cryptography is based on entirely different math problems. So it's like the difficulty of factoring large prime numbers. So the idea is if the prime is, it's the integer factorization problem. So it's an entirely different set of mathematics than symmetric. Symmetric is based on what we call complexity theoretic problems. So it's the idea that if you have this algorithm that can turn data into ciphertext, your belief is that this function is way too hard to reverse in the opposite direction. So your belief is in the complexity of this type of math you're using, which may or may not be true. A lot of it's, truthfully, a lot of academic guesswork. Like it's state of the art, but you're believing that a problem's hard to reverse engineer. Whereas next week, a young mathematician could come up and look at that problem and say, this is actually not so hard to reverse. Here's how you do it.
As long as we don't have quantum computers, it shouldn't be hard. It shouldn't be easy to give a prime number.
Right. So quantum computing is going to change things, especially for asymmetric. Now, symmetric, the effectiveness sort of gets split in half. So if whatever's 2 times strong today will be half that after quantum computing takes off. So it won't kill everything, but the government's already working on a contest, a worldwide contest for quantum computing oriented algorithms that can, take that into account.
So why incredibly large prime numbers as opposed to some easily findable number, but with a random subset of numbers inside of it, in pi. There's an infinite number of digits on a decimal. Why can't you just use a computer because pi's been solved the 20 trillionth place?
Mm-hmm.
Why not just kind of go down the line and get the first key is going to be 1415, and the next key is the next 4, and so on and so forth.
You mean why not choose those numbers to incorporate?
Yeah, why choose incredibly large prime numbers that have to be proven, as opposed to
Rational numbers.
Yeah, irrational numbers that are easily findable.
You mean as far as deriving the key when you're trying to derive
pi or tau or something.
Well, as an attacker, if I knew you were using segments of pi, that might give away what your keys are. If that become a standard, then wouldn't that would reveal what keys you're using. So that is very easy. That's sort of how you would do it with symmetric cryptography. So the only requirement for symmetric cryptography is that the key is pseudo-random. And pseudo-random to the extent that it's indistinguishable from something that would be purely random. So let's say you set up a speaker in downtown San Francisco and you recorded the random car honking throughout the day. you converted that to binary, and then let's say you had some way to measure the radioactive decay of some particle. So you have these two sets of random data, you put them together, you might say that those are truly random, that there is absolutely no pattern, or there can never be a pattern in these two sources mixed. Now, if you can build a computer algorithm that can generate random numbers, and if you hand me two sets of data, and you say which one was generated by a computer and which one is purely random, if I can't tell the difference, if I can run every mathematical test I can think of and I can tell no difference between the two, then we would say that that random data is cryptographically secure, or a cryptographically secure pseudo-random string. So that's a much easier thing to generate for symmetric keys. Whereas with public key cryptography, the way that you derive the public and private keys relies on problems that don't exist in a symmetric case. The downside is that it's really slow to find these numbers that work, and they have to be sufficiently large. So there's contests going on now that have been going on for decades. Who can solve these prime numbers, like 768. That's like one of the larger ones that's been broken in the past recent memory. So now we have to use like 3,000-4,000 bit public keys, whereas with symmetric cryptography you can use 256 bit keys. The keys are a lot smaller, therefore they're a lot easier to generate, and they're a lot faster. So you don't have the constraints that you do. Now the downside is that it's much more difficult to design asymmetric schemes because the math problems sometimes tend to be very fragile, or they're based on ideas that, we believe it's hard to factor large primes. Maybe someone will prove that wrong, that we can't, that it's those shortcuts that we haven't considered. So there's a lot of guesswork that we build up over time. I think this is here somewhere.
Sorry for all the files.
What's that? Oh, no worries. I will. This is a little cryptography involved here. Can I find the hidden? There we go. Nope.
Amazing how much is you.
Don't want to start the tour. No thanks. Okay. So, as I progressed through my career in cryptography, I was a single guy working in crypto, didn't have a family yet. I got married, I've got 3 daughters now, and I started thinking about when my daughters are old enough to ask me what I do and why I do it, because if you don't know what cryptography is and someone says that's what they do for a living, and you think about codes and math, that might seem not very fun to sit and look at random numbers all day. You might get an idea that cryptography is all about this very monotonous, asymmetric, symmetric this, all that. So I'm like, how can I talk about what I do in a way that makes sense for kids? And
Unrelated, I have cookies if anybody wants any.
You have cookies. Yeah. Save me one, please. They look good. And they're big cookies, too, so I like it.
Anyway.
What's that?
I know what that is.
Oh, thank you, sir.
You know it.
Those are fresh cookies, too. Yeah. I'm glad I came today. I can say, sure. Yeah. So I can say this is the first talk I've ever given and eaten a cookie at the same time. So I will make note of that. It makes it all the better, too. Thank you so much.
Well, this is all me. I did it in the 3 seconds that I walked in the kitchen.
Nice. So I started thinking about how I would teach cryptography to kids. And the idea is that, and I'll give you a bunch of links after this. I definitely want to make sure you have what you need to explore this further if you have an interest in cryptography. But very quickly you'll find that existing literature about cryptography, up until World War II, it was pencil and paper cryptography. So the way you built codes was algorithms that were simple enough that you had to be able to write them by hand. Because you didn't have computers. You didn't have very much hardware in the field. So if you're a military sending out troops, you didn't have, sophisticated radio equipment. You didn't have computers. There were no network centers that could send data to computing devices. You had to teach people in the field how to use pencil and paper ciphers. And there was even one where they had booklets. Now, I don't have one with me, but I have one of the originals from 1942, where you write your message on the paper, and on the back side is a piece of carbon paper that transfers a duplicate copy. And you had these little glass vials. So you tear out the carbon copy, you roll it up, you put it in the glass vial, and you tie it to the foot of a homing pigeon. There were special pigeons that they trained that knew how to fly from one location to another. So that's how they would send secret messages. So if you were, let's say, a German military, just out and about, you would see birds flying over, you wouldn't think a thing about it. But one of those birds could be a pigeon with a secret message that's going to deliver a message to some other troop regiment. So they spent large amounts of time training birds to go from one place to another, and that's how they would send messages. They would write it, put it in a small glass vial, tie it to the bird's leg, and send the bird off. Now, this was happening well into the 1940s. With World War II came about a cipher called the Enigma machine. So this was a typewriter-looking device that had hardware rotor wheels and all sorts of mechanics. It was able to encrypt things in such a robust, difficult way that it was impossible for people to break it by hand. The number of possibilities, the configurations was too much for a person to go through. Before that, ciphers were simple enough that given enough time, you could break them. So what happened is the only way to break Enigma was to build another machine that could go through the combinations faster. So you ended up with special purpose, digital computing hardware that essentially gave rise to digital computing and sort of led to the birth of computers, because they had to essentially build something more sophisticated than this machine to break it. Now, if you're learning about cryptography, that's as far as you can get. You can get without a math background, without, let's say, undergraduate level mathematics. That's about as much as you can understand. The difference there is when you get into cryptography like I work in, you're working in algorithms that are based on math that you wouldn't see until, let's say, you got to graduate level mathematics. Some of the math was designed by people with PhDs, which is even hard for most cryptographers to understand because it's so theoretical and high level. It's really intense stuff. It's sometimes hard for me to make my way through some papers without having to read 20 other papers first to get the background I need to understand what this algorithm is doing. So there's a gap between what we call classical cryptography and then the modern cryptography.
Unrelated, where do you find all those papers?
The cryptography papers?
Where do you find 20 math papers?
So there is, that's a good question, I'll make sure you get a link. There's an organization called IACR, the International Association of Cryptologic Research. They have thousands of papers that cryptographers will upload to the public. Now, these particular papers aren't peer-reviewed. So if you wanted to write a cryptography paper and you had some really good ideas, you could submit it. You might have a couple people look at it and sort of determine if it's good paper, and they'll publish it. So it's easier to get into that system. Most of the other papers come through what they call conference proceedings. So you'll submit a paper to a conference. If you're selected to speak, they publish your paper in book form and then online. To gain access to those, unfortunately, you have to subscribe and be a member. That's one of the things
that's
I'm...
the downside of
Yeah,
academia.
right. So that's one thing that a lot of us are pushing for, to make sure that copies of all academic papers are available, or that things are being done to make it easier for students to access data. Let's say if they don't have access to a database through their institution. So, yeah, it's a mixture of the two places. But you can get a lot of stuff online for free.
I know, you just email the author if they're still alive,
Right.
and probably send it to you, but
Mm-hmm.
because they don't get any kickbacks from the
Exactly.
publication.
Right.
But I just don't feel like having to pay $20, $30
Yeah.
every time you need to read something.
I remember there's an organization called IEEE, which is really big in hardware. They've been around for years. So actually, I think their history is more of electrical engineering. They've been around so long. But I published a couple papers with them, and of course they sent me free copies of the magazine. I mean, I wrote the paper, so might as well give me copies. I have copies anyway. But they charged, I think it was like 19 or 29 bucks to access the paper. So fortunately, you know, after time went by, they opened it up for free for download. Yeah, it's a difficult.
I understand.
Yeah, exactly. So definitely a solvable problem. Let's hope we get there. So with the gap between 1940s cryptography and what we have today, unless you understand the math, you don't really have an easy path to looking at something like the advanced encryption standard. And that's what we're going to look at today, a scaled down version.
Can you show us the scaled up version to show us the differences?
Yep, I am. Okay, so AES is what we call a block cipher. So a block cipher, there's two, it is a symmetric cipher. And in symmetric cryptography, you have two different kinds of ciphers, block ciphers and stream ciphers. So a stream cipher means that if I have, let's say, 100 megabytes of text I want to encrypt, I can generate a 100 megabyte key. And I can encrypt all of that bit by bit, let's say bit by bit. So one bit at a time is getting flipped and rearranged in some way. With a block cipher, instead of one long stream of data being encrypted a bit at a time, I'm encrypting chunks of data. So with the advanced encryption standard, it's taking that data and putting it into blocks of 128 bits. Then you have a 128-bit key, and that's used to scramble one block at a time. And you can build secure algorithms, whether or not they're stream ciphers or block ciphers. With stream ciphers, you can build super fast algorithms that run this really quick stream. Block ciphers sometimes have a little bit more processing involved, but today they are super fast. So there are different reasons that cryptographers design one way or another, and it usually comes down to complexity, security goals that they want to achieve. They want to say that, you know, based on this hard problem, this algorithm is secure as long as this problem isn't solved. There are different reasons. A lot of it comes down to how you're going to use it. So if I'm designing an algorithm for a smartphone, this is going to be different than if I design one for a supercomputer. Because a smartphone, the processor is extremely limited in comparison to a supercomputer, so I have to think very wisely about how I design this so it fits, so that it doesn't exceed the memory on the phone, that it doesn't exceed what the processor can do. So these days, a lot of it comes down to, you know, the needs.
So what's the difference between pseudocode and algorithm?
Pseudocode and algorithm? So pseudocode would be sort of, pseudocode would be a way to represent that algorithm.
Could you show us an example, like on the board, just like erase everything up there?
I actually have a paper. Yeah. Yeah. What's that?
I'm ready for it.
You're right. Yeah, I can show you an example of some pseudocode for an algorithm. Let's progress through this. So we've already covered that part about block ciphers encrypt in the form of chunks. Okay, so this is a diagram of the advanced encryption standard, sort of a 2D, sort of a 3D model. So let's say you're buying something on Amazon, you are playing Fortnite. They want to protect, yeah.
I can't do that.
You're doing it right now. I can see it.
They want to, Fortnite, they want to protect against cheaters. So
They do a terrible job of it.
yeah, a lot of gaming companies, they learn the hard way. But, so this algorithm is essentially what the majority of traffic online goes through. Now, they have other options of algorithms to use, but this is the federal standard. So in 1997, the National Institute of Standards and Technology published a bulletin. They said, we want cryptographers everywhere to submit their designs. Once we get the designs in, we're going to rank them. We're going to let some pass through to the next round. We're going to kick some out. Then at that point, we're going to have conferences all over the world where all of these cryptographers come together and try to break each other's algorithms. And they talk about it. They discuss why this one's better than that one. They publish their results like, hey, I broke your algorithm. Here's a paper to prove it. You're out. See you. It's sort of how that worked. Eventually, they worked down to 5 finalists. This was among them. So this was designed by 2 Belgian cryptographers in the mid-90s. It wasn't until 2001 where they made the final decision that this would become the standard for the government. So this applies to secret top secret government data. It's strong enough for that. But it's really fast. It's used in everything from mobile phones to VPNs to your browser when you do pretty much anything. And what you're seeing is sort of the data enters, you imagine it entering from the top. So these blocks right here are substitution tables. And what happens there is when your message flows into these little boxes, these substitution boxes, they get flipped around to something else. So on a very superficial level, you can imagine, let's say the letter A goes in and comes out an X. It just gets flipped to something random. And the way this happens is controlled by the secret key that you have. And that secret key of random information, when it's sort of inputted into the algorithm, can control how these work. Then it goes on to the next step. You can see these lines kind of moving around. So instead of changing the value, it's just rearranging their location. So let's say that the A was in the very first letter of your word was A. It goes to the boxes, it comes out an X, but instead of being the first letter, it's been moved over to the 5th place. So not only has it changed, it's moved location. So you can imagine very quickly how all of those things, first changing to something else, then being rearranged in location. Already it's pretty tough for a person to break that with pencil and paper. But you got to remember, we're in the computing age, so we're not worried about people breaking it by hand. We have to build something that a computer can't reverse engineer. And computers are really good at finding patterns if you set a cluster of high performance computers looking at patterns, going through different combinations. So if you don't do enough, they can very quickly find a way to backtrack and get all the way back to the original data. Then again, I mentioned that this cipher works in blocks. So you imagine 128 blocks. You can imagine these are laid out on a grid. So they've already been substituted or changed. They've been rearranged. And now it'll take the columns of the data in the block and then mix the columns up. So it's rearranged on the row. Now it's going to rearrange on the column. So at the very end, this master key, this secret key that you've used to sort of initiate this whole process, it's used to create a bunch of other subkeys that are used for each round. So this process can happen anywhere between 10 to 14 times on the same chunk of data. And each time it happens, it's using a different key that was created from that master key that you have. So you can imagine that each message is encrypted 10 to 14 times, and that's based on the size of the key. So if you're using a 128-bit key, it's 10 times. If you're using a 256-bit key, it's 14 times. So that's how secure this algorithm is, but that's what it has to do in order to keep a computer from reverse engineering. It has to go through that process over a dozen times for it to be secure. And what you end up with is something that is secure enough, but also fast enough. So some of the algorithms that didn't win, they were good, they're strong, but they require, let's say, 30 rounds. In order for it to be secure against the computer, they had to do a lot more work, which slows it down. So security-wise, the algorithm is just as good. But if you think about implementing something on a small mobile device, the smaller algorithm is going to give you better results. And for example, if you think about, people that buy smartphones, they're not thinking about cryptography, right? They just want to do whatever you do these days on a smartphone. So if the cryptography is so slow that it becomes noticeable, that it takes longer to access a website because the cryptography is having trouble using this processor, then Samsung's going to say, we're going to toss that out. We can't use that algorithm. It's not going to work because the customer notices that things are slower. So they have to make sure they're using really fast algorithms that they don't indicate that any cryptography is happening because they're so fast that you don't notice it, but at the same time secure enough that people don't have to worry about things getting captured and broken into. Now, this is something that even if you're an undergrad in math, you might not even get into sort of this application of math. Unless you take sort of more of the applied mathematics route, you might get into more, real, instances of cryptography. But a lot of this was developed, or the two cryptographers, they were PhDs. I believe both of them in electrical engineering. So they were really well versed in how to build things that work fast on hardware and software too. But if you're trying to teach this to anyone who's not already in a math sort of path career-wise, it's going to be really hard to do. But I wanted to find a way to talk about everything that's happening here in a way that could be done by hand. So that's sort of how I built out the Pocket Block project, which is completely open source for educators to download the material, to teach it to their classes. I do a lot of classes remotely and in person too. But the goal here is that anyone from, let's say, ages 7 and up can start learning advanced cryptography or the concepts of advanced cryptography without having to be a mathematician. So we're going to look. So a few things you're going to learn about. So who's heard of the sort of the Fibonacci sequence of math? Okay, gotcha. So that sequence is used in cryptography, very simple ciphers from years ago to generate keys. Now, for modern computing, it's not very secure because that sequence, it can be easily figured out, so you have to be more complex. But for this algorithm, I've designed one that uses what we call a key schedule. And a key schedule, if you see any crypto paper about block ciphers or stream ciphers, a schedule simply means they take a key and they turn it into a bunch of separate keys that are used for each round. So that every time you re-encrypt, you're not using the same key, you're using a key that was built using this master key. S boxes, which you saw at the very top of that 3D model, they're for changing the value of something. So an S box is going to change a 1 to a 0, or an A to an X, or whatever. It's actually changing the value. So it stands for substitution. P box stands for permutation. So you're not changing the value, you're just changing the location of that data. So like I said, if the A is in the first position, it turns into an X. Then I move the X over to the 5th place. That's changing its location, but its value stayed the same.
So how does it prevent like two values from being put in like fifth space or something? Like, let's say like the word is like about what's to prevent whatever the A and the B are shifted into
The same place.
Into like the last.
That's a great question. So the way you design it maps each bit to the place it needs to be. So the way it's built is to make sure that a specific bit will go into a specific location. So it's not randomized that there would be like a collision of places trying to get to the same spot. It's already built into that algorithm that this goes here, this goes there. So it's mapped out to the exact place that happens.
So you mean that there are some probability involved, because you said you mentioned permutation.
Mm-hmm.
And why do they choose permutation rather than combination?
So they want to use a mixture of both. So the idea is that when you get the final output of an algorithm, what we call ciphertext, it needs to be indistinguishable from random. So the two properties you want were established in probably the early 1900s, or actually probably the 1920s, I would say, called confusion and diffusion. So confusion is what you get when you change the value of something. Diffusion is when you have, let's say you have an English block of text. There's things you can learn about the English language that form patterns. So double letters, for example. When you see two T's together, that could hint at, the language you're using. Some languages never have two T's together. It's just the way languages are different. So if you look at different languages, you can learn structure, you can learn patterns. So in cryptography, you want to get rid of all that structure. So let's say I had two double letters together. If I flip the T and the T becomes a Y, then now I've got two Y's together, right? So it's still a double letter, even though it's different. So I haven't changed the structure, I've changed the value. So with diffusion, you basically take the structure and then you move it around so that all those patterns disappear. So that at the end of it all, everything looks entirely random. So when you look at ciphertext, it should be indistinguishable from me just randomly telling you random numbers and letters on a sheet of paper. There should be no way to tell between the two. So it's a mixture of confusion and diffusion, sort of changing and then moving around that removes that pattern altogether. So you need both of those components.
So it means we need both permutation and combination. In that case, when you encounter like a two-letter word.
Right. In actual cryptography doesn't happen at the character level, so it's happening at binary level. Right. So you got ones and zeros. So it's not going to be quite the case that you have two T's that you're trying to scramble. You'll have a block of binary text. So the idea is the same, though, that if you notice any patterns, you want to remove those. You want to diffuse them across the space so that whatever structure was there is completely gone at that point.
How much schooling did you do?
Sorry?
How much like school did you go through?
So I actually didn't go through math. I went through undergrad studies in information security. And the reason I did that is because when you go into the mathematical side of things, you're sort of setting yourself up for a more academic career, doing research, which is fantastic. Like if you like research, if you like actually being the person that, you know, discovers new theories and being sort of at that level of it all, math is what you need to go into. With InfoSec, you're sort of getting a mixture of the math you need to understand the cryptography, but you're getting the engineering mindset that you need to understand how this works in code securely.
What courses or areas would you recommend a person look into if they're math major?
Gotcha. So linear algebra, that's important. Combinatorics, you've got number theory. There are classes in math that specifically talk about number theory, you know, integer factorization into sort of the prime number space, things that you need in order to get a bearing on asymmetric cryptography. I've actually got a pretty exhaustive list that I'll share with you. Some that I didn't go into myself because they veered into a totally different direction than I've gone with cryptography, but have been a part of curricula for a lot of folks that I know that have went on to do cryptography full time.
I feel like any of the math that's come around since the Enlightenment, really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, a lot of the underpinnings of modern cryptography are based on concepts that have been around for a long time.
Yeah.
A long time. So it's not that we've had to necessarily devise brand new mathematics in recent years. We're just building on that. We're just discovering new ways to apply it.
Yeah.
You know?
What about like higher order logic?
Yeah.
Is that something necessary?
Definitely logic's helpful. Because you know, a lot of the operations, for example, exclusive OR. So if you have a lot of the, for stream ciphers, block ciphers too, the way they combine data, so the way you might encrypt data, is let's say, and do you understand, or have you heard about exclusive OR? So if you have 1 to 1, the answer is 0. So if the terms are the same, so 1 XOR 1 or 0 XOR 0 gives you 0. If the terms are different, the answer is 1. So 1 XOR 0, 0 XOR 1 is 1. So this way of combining data is how a cipher might do it. And it often uses multiple sort of logical operations, not just XOR. And they're very fast. That's the reason that you can implement these functions in hardware with minimal effort. They're super fast ways to combine data. And there's actually, there is an algorithm that is easy enough to do by hand that is more secure than the advanced encryption standard, but nobody uses it. It is 100% unbreakable. No computing power in existence can break it. So it's called the one-time pad, and it's been used since the early 1900s. It was developed, it was sort of co-developed independently by two military personnel and I think one inventor. The way the one-time pad works, it has 3 requirements, and it turns out that these requirements are so difficult to guarantee that it makes it unusable in practice. But it was used during wartime, well before computing. So if I have a message that is 1,000 characters long, the requirement is that the key has to be as long as the message. So the key has to be 1,000 characters long. Now with the advanced encryption standard, I have one key that's 128 bits, but I can encrypt terabytes of data with it. I don't have to change it. I can have a small key that can handle a lot of data. Netflix, for example. Imagine how much data they're streaming at any given time in high definition. Their algorithms are super fast, and they need to be able to have a system where the keys are small and the keys can be generated quickly and not have to be changed for long periods of time. With the one-time pad, the key has to be as long as the message you're encrypting, and it has to be truly random. So essentially, you would have to sit there and write down from your head 1,000 characters that appear random. Now, you might think it's totally random, but even in your mind, when you start sounding off random things, we're inclined to produce our own patterns. We're inclined to repeat things we just said a moment ago. So you're introducing bias into the system that might be guessable. And you can only use it once. It's called the one-time pad. So once you encrypt that message with that key, and you want to move to the next message, you can't reuse that same key Because now if somebody gets a hold of these two different ciphertexts encrypted with that same key, these two ciphertexts now have a relationship because they use the same key. And this particular system doesn't protect against those relationships. So if you had the two ciphertexts, you can learn and eventually get back to the plain text with just the ciphertext.
So, like, does this mean that, or like, for the cipher, can you like only use like random natural logic, or is it like anything that's truly random, which like is almost impossible to observe because of the
Exactly.
universe?
Right, so the requirement for the one-time pad is it has to get the theoretical guarantee, it has to be truly random. In practice, it's most likely not. But setting aside that requirement, what makes it unusable is the fact that the key can only be used for one message, and it has to be as long as the data itself. So imagine, a full-length, high-definition stream over Netflix. I don't know how large that might be, but let's say it's in the high gigabytes in size. Imagine the key having to be that same size. It's a massive amount of data. So for every stream, you're essentially doubling the size of the data you're working with. So, yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, it just looks like you add the values of the letters and the keys together and take a mod 26.
Yep, you can do it, right, mod 26 to combine them, or you can use, if you're doing binary, you can use exclusive OR. So if you have the 1 to 1, you get 0, 0 to 1 would be 1, so you just use that basic combination. So it's really a system that's so simple, you could teach it to a small child to do addition mod 26, not really hard. And it happens to be the most secure algorithm in existence, theoretically. The constraints around it are just too hard to implement. That's why you don't see it in use. That's why it sort of died out. It was used by the Soviets during the Cold War, and they made a mistake where they reused keys, and that led to lots of Soviet agents being captured and prosecuted.
What if you start out with one random key and use that in a chain with messages that just get longer and longer as they encrypt more and more?
You mean start out with a key that's longer than what you need?
Well, you start off with the basic key that's as long as your message, right?
Mhm.
And then you maybe make sure each message is the same length or less going on, and you keep combining them. Would that sort of be pretty secure, and then you just remember the key itself, and then be able to go back with all the messages?
Trying to understand here. So you got the key.
Yeah, so you have a big key, say
Right.
500 characters.
Right.
You have a message, 500 characters, you combine that. The combination is your new key. You use,
Oh, so you're taking the ciphertext from one and using that as the key for another message. So one of the properties of combining data this way is that the relationship is carried over from one text to the other. So what happens when you reuse the same key? Those two ciphertexts have a relationship. The same thing happens when you get the ciphertext from one key. It shares the relationship with the key before it. It's going to pass a part of that relationship on to the next set of data. So if you do this over and over, you have a large set of data where there's some relation between all of them. So it becomes a little bit harder to reverse, but those relationships still exist. So in the computing age, you'd very quickly be able to exploit that and work your way back. So it would be a lot harder if you were up against just humans with a pen and paper. But yeah, it's a good thought there. And then the last thing, and how are we doing on time? Okay, 11:40. All right, so we got about 20 minutes, 30 minutes?
You can stay as long as you like.
Okay, that's good. All right. Stay forever. I'll have to make a few calls and let some folks know they might worry. But as long as you have cookies, that's an easy way to keep me around. Oh, I'm good. That's plenty. Yeah, and then we've talked a lot about encryption. So we talked a lot about taking data and scrambling it into something you can't read. But perhaps one of the most important aspects of cryptography today is what we call message authentication codes. So, and this might not be very obvious, but if, let's say I take a stream cipher that's like the one-time pad. Let's say I have a packet sniffer and I capture this data. So let's say you've sent some data to her and I've managed to capture that data and it's encrypted. Okay, it's encrypted, but the operation that was used is just the exclusive OR. So 1 XOR 1 gave a 0. So if I see that 0 and I want to flip that before it gets to you, so I can, let's say, jam the transmission, or I want to resend that data to you pretending to be her as sort of a man in the middle, I can flip the bit of the ciphertext. So when you get the ciphertext, it's going to be different than what she sent. When you decrypt it, the value that you get on the other side is different than what she intended. So it's really easy to flip the bits of ciphertext to produce something else. Now, at first that might not sound very useful, because if you don't know what the ciphertext is, what value is there in flipping the bits of a message, because when you decrypt it, it's going to look messed up. So you're going to think there's an error in the text because it didn't decrypt properly. But if you've ever gone into like the Windows registry, for example, you see there's lots of settings that have 1 and 0 values, whether something's turned on or off. That setting in the registry could have something to do with security, some sort of security toggle in the system. So imagine a case where I gain access to some ciphertext that's only encrypted but hasn't been authenticated. If I'm able to force the system or have the system decrypt something without checking the authenticity of it, and let's say I knew the structure of the data that was being encrypted, even if I didn't know what that data was. So I knew that if I flip this bit, it's going to change the value in the registry for the security setting and turn it off. So even though I don't see what the value is, I know that this particular data in this packet corresponds to that on the system side. So I flip that bit, the system decrypts it, and now I've caused the system to change a value by flipping the bit of the ciphertext. And if it doesn't authenticate the data, the system's not checking to see whether that data was changed from the moment it was sent to the moment it arrived. So a message authentication code is an extra step that you produce a new code for your text. That way when you send it, the system first checks the authenticity of the system, and if it doesn't match, if the codes don't match, it tells you it's going to reject this data, you'll have to have it reset. Something's wrong with it. It could be an adversary trying to break the system, or it could be just an error in the system itself. Okay. So the first thing you need to do, and this is very simple with encrypting anything, is you need to have a key. So we have our algorithm, which we're going to look at in a minute, but we need to have a key. So let's start out. We're going to encrypt 36 characters in a 6x6 grid. So to make it easy, we're going to have a key that's 6 characters long. It's as long as the row, it's as long as the column. But we can't do operations with letters, so we need to find a way to turn this into numbers. So one simple way to do that is to give a number that corresponds with secret. Now, it might look like I randomly chose this, but you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the way I chose where these numbers went is I looked at each letter here and sort of where they fall in the alphabet. So alphabetically, C's first, so I made that 1. I've got 2 E's, so I just started with the E on the left and moved right. So that E's 2, that E's 3. R's next, then 5S, and then T6. So this is a very simple way to convert that to a number. Now, I mentioned with AES that you have this 128-bit key, but you encrypt it like 10 to 14 times with these rounds. And each time you do that, you get a new key. So that master key that you start with is used to generate what we call round keys. So each round gets its own key to make the process even more complex, so that there's no redundancy or no patterns between how each round works. So we need to take that and turn it into 6 more keys. Okay, so not sure how easy this is going to be to see, but so we have our master key at the top. Now, if you think about how the Fibonacci sequence works, do you have any idea how I got that first line? We'll start with that.
It's the 2 to the right, and then so it's like the one above it and the one over it, but like the last one doesn't make sense for that.
So, all right, so what's happening here is 5 plus 2 is 7.
Yeah.
2 plus 1 is 3. 1 plus 4 is 5. 4, 3, 7. Now you'll notice when you get to the end, you've got 3 plus 6 equals 9.
You subtracted the 5 from the 6 to get 1.
That's one way. Or, since you do go back, to get the 1, it would be 6 plus 5 equals 11. But we're not carrying, so we're doing addition without carrying. So instead of 11, we're dropping the 1 and keeping the 1. So anytime you have, it's sort of between 0 and 9. So if anything equals 10 or above, you take the rightmost digit. So then we can go ahead and we'll just toss that master key out, and we're going to build out using this new key. So 7 plus 3 equals 10. Of course, we don't carry, so we got 0. 3 plus 5 equals 8. We use this one to get that, this one to get that, all the way down. So now we've used a master key to get a bunch of round keys. So every time we encrypt, we're going to use a new key. And the AES does something very similarly. It does it on the binary level. It does it in a much more complex way. But this is essentially, conceptually, how it would be done.
Hypothetically, like, if you do this like 1,000 times, would a pattern like appear?
With this sequence? Yeah. Well, yeah, for this one, if you keep going, so 8, 8, if you keep going, I think, past 6 numbers, the next few will start repeating the lines.
Okay.
But in modern cryptography, of course, the complexity of a key schedule, even though it's simple to a cryptographer to devise, it's one of the more simpler components of a cipher, it's still complex enough to prevent any patterns.
Can somebody use an arithmetic sequence to get obviously an arithmetic sequence can get
So, like in modern, like regular cryptography, can you use a sequence, or you mean for this?
yes,
So, I'll point out that the idea behind this system is just to teach the concepts. So none of this you'd want to use in practice to be secure. It would be very simple for you to automate this.
for generating new keys.
Right, exactly. So I've written some very basic code that'll do that. That will populate and keep building it out 10,000 times if you wanted to. Of course, the longer the string you have up here, the more you get before it starts to repeat itself. But this is just to sort of, get the points across about how key scheduling works. Okay, so now that we have a key, let's encrypt some data with it. All right, so let's say we have a plain text message. This is a secret message that we need to hide. So I'm going to write that message across the grid, just left to right till we get to the very end. So for this example, I've chosen something that fits nicely into this box. If it goes over into another block, then you just cut it off and you put that in your next block that you encrypt. And that's sort of how cryptography works. It only takes, for the example, the advanced encryption standard will encrypt the first 120 bits. Whatever's after that will be for the next block and thereon after. So I've highlighted this top row because what we're going to do is shift a column. So if you look, this is where we start. And we're going to use this key to shift everything in the column down. And the way we'll do that is each column gets its own number. So column 1, we've shifted it 7 times down. So the T was originally here. So if we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the new location for the first letter is here. The next gets 3, so 1, 2, 3. So if you look, you see T-H-I-S-I-S. This is. So we've used this key to change the position of the columns. Now that we've changed the position of the columns, let's do the rows. All right, so now these are the values that we're going to move on the right side. We're going to use the next key in the line. So if you have a 0, of course, you would do nothing. So this T, instead of moving to the right, it just stays where it's at. Now, in cryptography, this wouldn't be a very secure thing. Like, you want all the operations to do something. But for this example, we'll just assume that it goes nowhere because the number's 8, or number's 0. The next will go 8 places. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The next one, 2 places, 1, 2, and then so on until you have. So now we've used 2 different round keys, or 2 different keys we generated from that master key that we started with, to move things by the column level and now by the row level. Okay, so now what we're going to do, now that those 2 things are permutations. We didn't change the value. So if you look, everything in our original message is still here. It's just scrambled up. All the letters are the same. Nothing's changed. But now we want to do what happens in that substitution box. We want to change the value of the characters. So what we're going to do here is move